contempla todos estos mecanismos, plebiscito, referendo, etcétera. Algunos son vinculantes, otros no. Es nada más un recordatorio de que el marco normativo existe, y más allá del marco normativo se tienen que buscar pues, los mejores mecanismos para asegurar la legalidad social. Les voy a dar un par de ejemplos que van más allá del aeropuerto, nada más para entender por qué es muy relevante en nuestra ciudad. Tenemos el tren interurbano México-Toluca, es una mega obra con 38,000 millones de pesos, no se ha consultado a la población afectada. ¿De qué está pasando? Bueno, ya algunos vecinos han denunciado que no conocen los estudios de impacto ambiental, que ha habido violaciones de derechos de suelo, opacidad en el diseño. Entonces, la Secretaría de Transporte reaccionó cambiando la ruta del CETRAM. El CETRAM es el Centro de Transporte Modal. Ya se está llevando a cabo la construcción, pero no conocemos el proyecto. Esa foto que ven ahí es un render en la página de Procía México. Procía México es la paraestatal encargada del proyecto. Es 3,400 millones de pesos. Ya se otorgó una concesión por 44 años. No se consultó a los vecinos, no conocemos detalles sobre el inversionista ganador, hay muy poca información. Y de hecho, la Contraloría General del Distrito Federal realizó una auditoría a Procía México y encontró irregularidades. Básicamente, que mucha de la información que se propuso como parte del concurso se elaboró antes de que iniciara el proceso de selección. Estos son como los malos ejemplos. Algo que empezó mal y pinta un poco mejor en términos de participación ciudadana es el Corredor Cultural Chapultepec. Para nuestros invitados extranjeros, este es un proyecto que ha estado muy sonado en los medios porque afecta a una zona clave de la ciudad. Se hizo público el proyecto ya que básicamente todo estaba decidido, generó muchísima controversia y sí estamos viendo una reacción por parte del gobierno. Ya se abrió el secreto fiduciario porque todo eso estaba en una figura jurídica cerrada de escrutinio público, que es un fideicomiso privado. Ya se involucró al Instituto Electoral del Distrito Federal y se ha comprometido públicamente a que se va a llevar a cabo el proyecto que escoge la ciudadanía. Nótese que este proyecto está colinda juntito al CETRAM Chapultepec y hay toda la información sobre este en los medios y del otro no se menciona nada, a pesar de que impacta la misma zona. Pues bueno, estos son unos ejemplos que le dan un poco de contexto a la importancia de la participación ciudadana en grandes proyectos urbanos en nuestra ciudad. Y les cuento un poco sobre qué es que busca el observatorio. Ya ayer Luis Zamorano de STS en Vale les platicó, entonces resumirlo. Estos son los logos de las instituciones: el Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad, en donde yo trabajo, CTS en Bar, donde trabaja Luis, México Evalúa, que ayer alguien, Mariana Campos nos acompañó, y el Centro Mexicano de Derecho Ambiental. Poco después, un par de meses después del anuncio presidencial, el año pasado, llevamos a cabo unos foros ciudadanos, pues la gente tenía muchas dudas y preocupaciones sobre el aeropuerto. Esto fue una oportunidad para dialogar con la ciudadanía. Hubo una serie de presentaciones. Víctor fue uno de los ponentes sobre el tema de los slots y demás. Esos son los 4 temas que están ahí que tocamos: medio ambiente, competitividad y desarrollo económico, desarrollo urbano y movilidad e inclusión social. Y fueron bastante concurridos y después sacamos un documento en el que presentamos lo que se concluyó en los foros y además un análisis adicional donde identificamos principales preguntas que teníamos para el gobierno. Hemos tenido diálogo con el Grupo Aeroportuario de la Ciudad de México, que es la agencia gubernamental a cargo del proyecto. A raíz de esto tuvimos una reunión con la CONAGUA, la Comisión Nacional del Agua, a cargo de un proyecto hidráulico, porque no sé si lo sepan los extranjeros, pero es un gran reto este proyecto en términos hidráulicos y de cimentación de suelo, porque tiene particularidades muy peculiares. Antes era un lago, entonces bueno. Y también vamos a tener una reunión sobre la técnica de cimentación de suelo. Por lo mismo que era un lago, realmente se hunde muchísimo y eso es otro reto. Esto es básicamente lo que hemos hecho. ¿Y a futuro qué buscamos? Bueno, continuar con el análisis, el acompañamiento y propuestas sobre temas en el que cada una de nuestras instituciones puede agregar valor. Ayer Luis Zamorano mencionó el plan de movilidad. México Evalúa ha hecho análisis sobre el proceso de licitaciones en el pasado, concluyendo que ha habido falta de transparencia. Ahora empieza un nuevo proceso, el gobierno ya anunció que va a cumplir con los estándares de contratación abierta, entonces esperamos que así sea y vamos a tratar de acompañarlo en este proceso, en la definición de indicadores, para que no sean indicadores laxos, sino que realmente sean los indicadores que requiere el país. Cumplimiento de las condiciones de la MIA. La MIA es la manifestación de impacto ambiental y la Secretaría de Medio Ambiente, para dar su aprobación a un megaproyecto, requiere que varias condiciones se cumplan. Entonces, tenemos que ir viendo qué también se está cumpliendo, si está en tiempo o no, qué se está haciendo. Y también cuestiones regulatorias. La asignación de slot, que es el gran tema del día de hoy, es algo en el cual nosotros nos gustaría empezar a meternos mucho más, porque ha estado fuera de las medios. Realmente, hasta ahora solo se habla de construir un aeropuerto y se habla de infraestructura y el edificio, y hasta ahí llega la discusión. Pero ya que se inaugura todos los enormes retos que hay detrás, pues no ha sido parte de la discusión. También buscamos facilitar información sobre el proyecto para la ciudadanía. En nuestra página, ahí está la página. Ayer Luis les dio mal la página, ahora que la quieren escribir. Es observatorionaisin.mx al final. Entonces ahí se resume la información de los foros y también pues hay una sección de noticias donde vamos sacando los blogs que vamos escribiendo y noticias clave. Ahora, para concluir, realmente no hay precedente para un proyecto del tamaño del NAICIN en esta ciudad y tampoco hay precedente para un observatorio ciudadano que busque acompañarlo. Este es un proceso de muy largo plazo, o sea, es una carrera de resistencia. También es un reto porque, por un lado, nosotros queremos acompañar al gobierno. Nosotros no buscamos tirar el proyecto. Cualquier crítica que haremos será una crítica constructiva que busca fortalecer el proyecto e incrementar las probabilidades de éxito del mismo. Sin embargo, pues tenemos que encontrar un balance entre, por un lado, pedirle información al gobierno y, por otro lado, analizarla y quizás llegar a conclusiones que no es lo que el gobierno le gusta escuchar, ¿no? Entonces, digamos que es difícil, es de muy largo plazo. El primer reto, primero no por ser el principal, sino por ser el primero cronológicamente, es obtener información. Sin información es difícil hacer análisis. Y si el gobierno no te da información, pues no hay mucho que puedas hacer. Entonces, digamos que hemos construido una relación buena con el gobierno, nos gustaría tener mucha más información de lo que tenemos, y esto es un aprendizaje continuo y de largo plazo. Estamos ganando aliados. Esta conferencia, por ejemplo, creemos que puede ser útil para conocer expertos en el tema que después nos pueden asesorar y acompañar, y eso es todo por ahora. Gracias.
Thank you, Ana. I would like to ask you a question about the comment that you mentioned in the beginning of your presentation about the forecasting of the demand. You mentioned some paper that is a survey, I think, about the methodologies that he was analyzing about projection and forecasting. And at the end, you mentioned that you are expecting to model these or changing these projections. Are you or your analysis based on some methodology or something like that?
Thank you. Well, we're actually not modeling the projections. What we're doing first is analyzing whatever information is available about the financing scheme of the airport, which is not much. I just wrote a blog about this at the CNN Expansión, and in it what we say is that the government has mentioned over and over that this is a self-financing project, although the percentage of public funds that will go into funding it are decreasing over time, as was to be expected because of the recent budget cuts, federal budget cuts. So what we want first of all is to have more information about the details of the financing scheme. We know about the loans that they have acquired, that the government has acquired, but we don't know the interest rates, whether they have a guarantee or not, what the conditions are, because undoubtedly this project could in fact obtain a lot of funding, but the question is, at what price? Under what conditions? Is it going to be very expensive or not? And in terms of projections, we know nothing about the projections. We just know some of the projections. And at the Finance Ministry webpage, Secretaría de Hacienda, there is a cost-benefit analysis, which is public, which is very general. It's only an executive summary of the analysis that they supposedly made in order to obtain the approval of the Finance Ministry. But from that information, you really cannot understand what the assumptions behind the model are. So our first question is for the government to explain what the assumptions are. Because Mexican track record and international track record is not very good. So our point is, let's be vigilant about this. This is something that should be in the media. This is something that we should all be concerned about. And right now, no one's talking about it. So, thank you.
Next, I will present our second speaker. Keita Guiomar is a lecturer in economics at the Dublin City University Business School and at its Aviation Institute. Until 2014, he was Commissioner for Aviation Regulation in Ireland, responsible for implementing the EU slot regulation. Please welcome.
So, following Mike. Lamentablemente, yo no hablo mucho español, pero quiero decir muchas gracias a los organizadores por la invitación. Espero poder ofrecer algunas observaciones útiles sobre mi trabajo en Irlanda, en una oficina reguladora que se ocupe de las reglas de aviación de la UE. Y disculpe mi pronunciación. So, I was asked to come here and talk a little about the practitioner's view of the slot regime. For about 10 years, I was running an office in Ireland which had price regulatory responsibilities, so yesterday's discussion was obviously of interest, but I'm here now to talk about the application in Ireland of the slot rules. And just as a few preliminaries, although Ireland is a very small country with only 6 million people on the island, Dublin Airport is not quite so small. So Dublin Airport has about 25 million passengers a year. It has recently built a very large new terminal. It's planning to build a parallel runway, so I think there are, in fact, potential lessons for Mexico City from the Irish experience. Yesterday, Frank Bernardino summed up his conclusions at the beginning and said, please don't copy New York. And I would be saying to you, please don't copy the European Union either. Fortunately, if it's already been decided to do something similar to that, there are still steps that I think a regulatory office could contemplate changing, could contemplate introducing, which would promote efficiency. Mexico is going to be spending an enormous sum of money building a new airport. We've done that in Dublin just recently. You surely want to use that expensive facility efficiently when it's in operation. So time is a little bit short, but I'll say something about the EU slot regulations. In fact, Mark Trethewey this morning has covered a lot of that, so I may not stop at those slides very much. Then something about the institutional arrangements to implement those rules, some of the difficulties that arise. Our own experience of applying the rules in Ireland has been painful some of the time. Then about the coordination of the regulatory perspective and the crucial consideration of competition. I'd say something about the shortcomings of administered slot rules, not price-guided slot rules, but administered slot rules. And I'll also finish up then by saying that the position Mexico City will find itself in the future when the new airport has been built in terms of runway slots depends very much on the investment decisions made now about capacity. So there's a connection between the capacity investment decision today and the scope you have in the future to have a better or a worse set of slot rules. And then I'll express my conclusions. since I don't work as a regulator any longer, I can be a little bit more blunt than in the past. So I'm going to mention only some of these rules. From a practitioner point of view, the language in the slot rules is crucial. So as Mike said to you this morning, if you want to designate an airport as coordinated in the European Union, you must do and be seen to have done all of the following things. You need a thorough capacity analysis. It must use commonly recognized methods. It must be published and discussed with the industry. It must find that there is a shortfall in capacity so serious that there will be significant delays at the airport that cannot be got around by investments or operational changes over a reasonable horizon. And if you make a coordination decision and you cannot demonstrate to a court that you've gone through all of those steps, the court is likely to quash your decision, and that's an experience we've had ourselves. Taking up maybe the point made in the first presentation this morning about the difference between what's done in practice and what the rules prescribe. The European Union rules say that if an airport is designated as coordinated, but later comes to have sufficient capacity, strictly speaking, it should revert to being a scheduled coordinated airport. But I at least don't know any examples where that has ever happened. Yesterday, in the ground handling session, you heard about an airports package in the European Union. Part of it relates to ground handling, parts of it relates to slots. I won't go through all of these proposals to modify the European Union rules. Just say that it seems to me that these are the kind of proposals that are made by civil servants when really no significant change is intended. So little tweakings at the edges. Of course, it would matter if there was to be explicit allowance for the selling of slots. That would be a material change. But there are a lot of other suggestions that really don't change the scheme fundamentally. In any case, this is a revision of the law proposed in 2011. It's still being discussed in 2015. Change hasn't occurred. The officials of the European Union, the civil service of the European Union, is conscious of the inefficiency of the existing rules. Many European airports are congested. The limited capacity which is there is not being efficiently used. European officials are trying to propose modifications to the EU slot rules to make the system work better, but it's very difficult to get change. What about the institutional arrangements to give effect to these kinds of schemes? Well, in Ireland, 3 entities are involved. The regulator has to decide about the status of the airport. So airports will come to the regulator and say, we believe our status should be changed. The regulator makes that decision. The regulatory office also chooses or appoints the facilitator or the coordinator if there is one at those airports, typically on a 5-year cycle after an international tender. The competition authority is responsible ex post for applying competition law. The Transport Ministry is responsible for setting sanction schemes and so on. There is a particular wrinkle in the Irish case where the lawyer's interpretation of the Irish Constitution, which is not everybody's interpretation, is that only courts can impose a fine. So on the slot side, if you have an airline misusing slots at the airport, nobody except the courts can impose a fine. The ministry, the regulator, competition authority, none of those bodies can do this. Everybody has to ask the court to impose the fine. A lot of time passes. It's not a timely methodology, and the court may or may not agree to do what you want, or what you think is called for in that situation. Briefly, our history. Oh, sorry, well, just to talk about other countries, Ireland is after all a very small place. Only 2 European countries have standalone aviation regulatory offices, Ireland and Britain. The other states have these functions handled within the Transport Ministry, sometimes on what is said to be a functionally separate basis. Not everybody finds that a very convincing description. The UK is unusual in that they have agreed a regime, I don't recall the exact phrase, but there's a regime where the competition body or the regulatory body may each of them enforce competition or regulatory law. So they have a kind of, each of them has a dual function, presumably to avoid duplication and reaching contradictory decisions. And that's an interesting approach to trying to make sure that competition issues take the rightful place in making regulatory decisions. So our history of the slot regimes at Dublin has been, the airport came to us, Dublin Airport came to us in 2001, wanted to be deemed coordinated. We had a thorough capacity analysis, it was published, it was discussed with the industry, and the regulator decided to deny this status to the airport because, as Mike's presentation this morning showed, the spirit of the rules, if you take them at face value, is to impress on the airport to maximize the use of capacity, not just to switch to a coordinated status and limit use of the runway. So we said, well, the airport needs to go away and make better use of its facilities. The same answer was given in 2004 when the airport came back again. But the traffic had grown a lot in the meantime. And there were two conditions set. One was that the voluntary regime would stay in place as long as airlines cooperated genuinely with the voluntary scheme and changed their schedules to a new time, if that's what the coordinator asked them to do, and also provided that the traffic didn't accelerate very suddenly. Both of those conditions were in fact breached very quickly afterwards. Therefore, the following year, a decision was made to give coordinated status to Dublin Airport. One of the airlines immediately went to court and said, but there wasn't a new thorough capacity study carried out. And our answer was, but it's only 6 months since we went through all of that. But the court said, well, on a face value reading of the regulation, there must be a thorough capacity study every single time you contemplate a change in the status, and therefore our decision was quashed and we went back to square one and did a new capacity study and went through the whole exercise for the third time. So I think the lesson from Mexico City is if you adopt a set of rules like this, you may find it more complicated than you would like it to be to apply the regime, because you're at risk that one of the other parties finds it advantageous for themselves to go to court or to seek to force you to do things that you didn't expect to have to do. Coordinated competition and regulation in the Irish case, there's a memorandum of understanding between the two offices designed to facilitate exchange of information and to allow one party to allow the second one to take action in a particular instance. And this hasn't actually been called upon on slot regulatory issues so far because, of course, the Irish Competition Authority has bigger problems to deal with. There is a question, and I think this conference has really answered it, about the compatibility of the regulatory and competition perspectives. I would suggest that this morning's discussion is that we begin with the optimum and say, let's concede as little as possible. Let's try to get as close to this position as possible. Oh, let's keep all the lawyers out of the room, because those guys are just spokesmen for vested interests. And we'll try and get the economy to the optimum position. The lawyers start with the status quo, that perspective, not just the lawyers, of course. Start with the status quo, and they say, well, the economists tell us that over the mountains over there's an optimum, but let's just take one step in the right direction. Tomorrow will be better than today, and that will be progress, and let's be satisfied with that. And of course, keep all those economists out of the room because they have crazy utopian ideas and they really stand in the way. So if the regulatory and the competition rules are being applied by two different offices and they belong to these two different perspectives, there may be deadlock really in trying to have both perspectives properly taken into account. So I think there can be some difficulties of that kind. What are the efficiency and competition concerns with the European Union tax slot rules? Well, slots, as we've heard, are allocated on an administrative set of principles, so that might be non-discrimination and transparency. But of course, efficiency requires discrimination. You want to treat a runway movement by a large aircraft flying a long distance differently to a biplane that wants to fly off the runway at the same time, land half a mile away. So the logic of those two approaches are just inherently in conflict. And although you can write into a set of administrative rules, specifications about efficiency, there's still going to be tension between the administrative principles and the efficiency principles. Of course, slots allocated on grandfather principle without prices suppress information about the value of those slots, and indeed the value of the shortage of capacity, which would be informative for future investment decisions. And Aval said yesterday that there are studies being done at Heathrow at the moment about the value of implicit value of congestion. Well, the CAA has certainly done those studies for quite a number of time. I know one study from the early 2000s, 2002, I think, which said that the value to an airline of a Heathrow runway slot was about £100 sterling in terms of the premium of the ticket price over that airline flying from a different airport. But the airline was paying the airport about £10 sterling for using the runway. So there was a complete mismatch between the value of the capacity and the price that was being charged. Strictly on a competition perspective, obviously administered slots are barriers to entry. If you take the case of Ryanair, which is one of the largest European low-cost carriers, I mean, it has grown from fewer than 1 million passengers to of the order of 110 million this year. It uses secondary airports, but if it had needed to use primary airports, that expansion could not have taken place because there would have been no way to obtain slots. And of course, the very value of those slots to the incumbent airlines motivates the resistance to changes to rules. And clearly, there can be obscurities about the assignment system. Some jurisdictions may be better than others, but there are always some obscurities about who is in fact getting the restricted number of slots. The European Union has been commissioning academic studies for 20 years, showing the benefits of modifying the current scheme, but those reports are gathering electronic dust online, and this current regime remains in force. So just to say something then about the connection between investment and the slot regime that follows on afterwards. We've already heard in the earlier presentation today about cost overruns. So of course you want to build your airport economically. You need to decide on what capacity that airport ought to have. And because traffic forecasts are uncertain, you really should decide in advance for whom it will be a problem if the traffic doesn't materialize. Is it a problem for the airport, which has built too large an airport and doesn't have enough passengers now to cover its costs? Or is it a problem for the airlines because the prices are adjusted to compensate for the lower traffic? Those are things that are better clarified in advance, because certainly once the money is spent, things can become ugly. In the Irish case, the new terminal opened just as the worst recession of the century hit, and you can imagine there were problems with that. If you don't price for runway usage, whether it's pricing for slots or through the aeronautical charges themselves, then of course airlines will demand lots of new capacity. So Dublin Airport currently wants to build a 3.7 kilometre parallel runway. The view of the regulatory office was that a normal length runway would be used by almost all the airlines and therefore could form part of the aeronautical charge. The extra length, the extra kilometre, would be used by specific airlines for very long haul services, and really there should be a dedicated charge for them to reflect certain facilities being provided specifically for their needs, and it shouldn't be charged to the generality of users. And the regulators encourage the airport to price regulate, to have time of day charging, to demonstrate whether the demand in the peak hour or peak period is in fact sufficient to justify building a parallel runway. If you don't have price discrimination, then of course when there's sufficient capacity, it's very straightforward. The airlines schedule whenever it suits them. If there's a shortage of capacity, the airlines have a choice. They either press the airport to build a second runway,
or they have to change their schedule. And if you have pricing for using the runway at certain times of the day, there's a financial motive there straight away for that second course to be taken, unless it really is worthwhile to build a parallel runway. So decisions about runway capacity in particular will make it easier or harder in the future to operate a slot system. So there are a lot of particular issues about airport investment which aren't the subject of this session, which, if they're got right, will make it easier later to operate the slots. Conclusions then are, first of all, make sure that you're getting the most use out of your existing runway. Our experience in Dublin is, if air traffic control modifies its separation rules, if the airlines modify their operational practices, if the airport builds some more taxiways, you can get many more movements out of a runway than otherwise. And obviously you want to do that before you spend hundreds of millions on parallel. Then you need to plan for the new facilities, where everybody understands who will be responsible if the traffic doesn't materialize. You want to allocate the runway space using prices, as I said. I wouldn't like to be the person who would go to Google and propose a grandfather principle and say, well, I had an ad yesterday and I'm buying an ad today, so I should really have the ad tomorrow for the same price. And that's only by way of saying that in aviation, we're very familiar with administrative allocation. We sort of take it for granted. But outside aviation, it would be considered a fairly bizarre arrangement. And therefore, aviation needs to be aware, really, that just because it's familiar with a certain approach, that may not be the efficient approach, essentially approach. And then I think we saw in the first session this morning, in discussing the US experience, and certainly it's the case in the European Union, the rules were introduced in 1993, and 25 years or so have been spent trying to substitute a better scheme. But essentially the initial principles are still there. And we heard a lengthy discussion this morning about modifications to the American scheme. So if a slot regime is introduced in the new Mexico City airport, it would be a lot harder to change afterwards than to contemplate a more flexible scheme now. So my general conclusion then is the European Union is now in a position where it has to think about things like abolishing or modifying the grandfather principle, dealing with all the rows that would produce and moving to a pricing system in some form. And I think Mexico should try to keep open the possibility for as long as possible of substituting a more market-based or more flexible system to avoid finding itself in that position in the future. At the very end of the slide, I think there are some references and some web links and so on, if you want to follow up some of these things later on. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. I want to ask you a question about it's more like a comment. In spite of the final conclusion that you gave us in your presentation, which will be the best recommendation that you can give us for the new report according to the slot allocation?
Okay, I think what I would be saying is, if we heard yesterday that there may be already an agreement between the Mexican Transport Ministry and IATA, then I would say, given that, there's a question for a price regulatory agency, if there is to be an airport price regulatory agency in Mexico, to operate a pricing regime that includes time of day or congestion pricing at at New Mexico Airport, to drive as much efficiency as you can in the new facility. So we've had the experience in Dublin where the regulator's office compelled the airport to have different runway charges at busy and quiet times. But that's not really ideal because traffic patterns change, and therefore what is a busy time changes. And therefore it's best if the airport, with the up-to-date information, and modifies the scheme itself. So having the regulator do it one move for a 5-year period is not great. Certainly that was our experience. But I mean, that's what I was saying, that you would impress upon the airlines that it's not completely at their discretion when they schedule services. If they want to punch them all into the early morning, some other busy time, there should be a pricing effect that makes them take account of it.
Thank you. Then we can open up for questions.
Sí, Ana, me parece muy bien que ustedes no se enfoquen en querer tirar el proyecto. El proyecto se va a tener que caer solo, como se tiene que tirar la línea 12 si es que algún día quieren que eso funcione. Entonces, ¿cómo podemos alertar, ¿sí?, sobre una crónica de un fracaso anunciado?
Bueno, en términos de alertar, nosotros lo que queremos es acompañar al gobierno en los temas que ya están en los medios y poner en la mesa otros que no están. Por ejemplo, todo el tema de la asignación de slots, ya vimos que es un área donde puede limitarse la competencia entre aerolíneas, lo cual perjudica a los usuarios. Eso es algo que nosotros como observatorio queremos que se empiece a discutir, que se empiece a analizar de qué manera se hace en México, de qué manera puede ser mejor. Y es algo que ahorita no es parte de la discusión. Las licitaciones, por ejemplo, el gobierno dijo que se va a ajustar a los estándares de Open Contracting Partnership. Bueno, nosotros no nos vamos a quedar tranquilos solo porque declararon eso, ¿no? Vamos a ver qué implica esto, de qué manera lo están haciendo, qué indicadores están haciendo. Yo espero que no se caiga el proyecto porque no creo que nos convenga a nosotros, al margen del gobierno. O sea, yo creo que a los mexicanos no nos convendría que después de todo el dinero que ya se invirtió, esto fuera un fracaso y fuera un elefante blanco y nos quedáramos con el aeropuerto que ya tenemos saturado. Entonces, yo quiero apostar a que esto se funcione y desde la ciudadanía hacer lo que podamos para que así sea, ¿no? Lo cual no quiere decir que avalamos a priori el proyecto ni mucho menos, sino todo lo contrario. Hay que estar encima del gobierno para que las cosas se hagan bien. Eso es lo que queremos. Hay que trabajar hacia ello, no tenemos nada asegurado.
Hay que tener fe al presidente.
Pues no sé, presidente. Yo creo que hay que tener fe y aplicarse a trabajar, ¿no?
Ok, thank you. Rafa.
Bueno, yo, retomando, ya estamos haciendo la asignación de los slots y todo, pero creo que algo muy importante es saber si ustedes como observatorio ciudadano, y bien dijiste que uno de los mayores problemas es lo que tiene el aeropuerto. Entonces, mi pregunta sería, ¿ustedes han hecho estudios va a salir mucho más caro de lo que dijeron, ¿no? ¿Ustedes han hecho estudios de eso? Y la otra pregunta que yo tendría es, si han hecho estudios de otras soluciones, por ejemplo, ¿por qué lo tienen que poner en un lugar donde saben de antemano que va a ser tan caro? ¿Por qué no ponerlo en otro lugar? O ¿por qué no hacer un sistema aeropuertario de verdad? Que tenemos 5 aeropuertos que tienen capacidad. ¿Por qué no utilizamos todos los aeropuertos? Y en ese caso, ¿cuál sería la posición de ustedes como observatorio ciudadano?
Ok, dos preguntas diferentes. Respecto al tema de la cimentación, hemos estado en conversaciones con el grupo aeroportuario que está a su vez trabajando con el Instituto de Ingeniería de la UNAM. Nosotros como observatorio jamás pretendemos ser expertos técnicos. O sea, el Instituto Mexicano para la Competitividad, donde yo trabajo, por ejemplo, no tiene la capacidad ni expertise para hacer estudios sobre cimentación del suelo, ¿no? Ingeniería de muy alto nivel. Más bien es hacer las preguntas adecuadas y asegurarnos que la información esté disponible. Nosotros ya mandamos una serie de preguntas al grupo aeroportuario y la idea es que nos reunamos con los expertos que están tomando todas estas decisiones y que nos den esa información, así como nos reunimos con Conagua y la información que nos dieron ya es pública en nuestra página. Y son preguntas muy básicas, porque no son preguntas de ingeniero o de experiencia en el tema, sino, a ver, ¿Cuáles son los criterios que se tomaron para analizar las opciones? Sabemos, no se publica, que hay 9 terapeutas de prueba que se están analizando. Entonces, entender cuáles son los parámetros que están analizando, el costo, se mencionaron unas cifras en los medios, entender cuál va a ser el costo final, bajo qué rubro está contemplado del presupuesto ya aprobado. Y justamente cuando estás encima de estos temas, haciendo las preguntas y obteniendo las respuestas, eso es lo que te permite saber de entrada si está costando más de lo que dijeron y si sí, cuánto más. ¿Y por qué? Porque habrá cosas que serán justificadas. O sea, la verdad también sería un poco ingenuo decir que si cuesta un poco más de lo esperado es un fracaso y se hizo mal, etc. O sea, entender el por qué, ¿no? Quizá costó más porque hubo un acto de corrupción, lo cual está mal, ¿no? O costó más porque no sé, hubo un tema macroeconómico que hizo que el costo de financiamiento fuera más caro. O sea, entender, tener información. Y respecto a las otras propuestas de aeropuerto, que la principal que se presentó fue la de Tizayuca, ¿no? El análisis costo-beneficio que está incluido en la cartera de proyectos de inversión de la Secretaría de Hacienda incluye un análisis sobre crecer el aeropuerto de Toluca y llega a la conclusión que no soluciona el problema. Parece un análisis general. Es un resumen de un análisis, no que un análisis. Nosotros, cuando hablo de nosotros, hablo del aeropuerto, del observatorio, las instituciones que lo componen, las organizaciones, las instituciones. Decidimos adoptar una visión más pragmática, es decir, este proyecto ya está en curso. Desde que lo anunció el gobierno, o sea, ya se tienen contratos hechos, todas las obras hidráulicas que son carísimas, se está haciendo con agua y que benefician no solo el polígono, sino a todas las zonas alrededor, porque en Tuba va a haber ríos y en fin, no me trae detalles, pero es un macro proyecto hidráulico. Se llevó a cabo mucho antes de que se anunciara el aeropuerto, se tienen contratos millonarios ya hechos, la propuesta. Entonces, creemos que o sea, el momento para ver si es mejor hacerlo en otro lado, que ya se nos pasó, nosotros queremos enfocarnos ahorita es invertir todo nuestro tiempo y recurso en que está en curso se haga bien, que no haya actos de corrupción, que no haya opacidad, que no se tomen malas decisiones, y es básicamente lo que estamos enfocados ahorita, ¿no?
Pero es mucho dinero, ¿no? Como para pensar que ya ahí se decidió. Todavía no se pone en David, ¿por qué no ponemos otro lado?
Bueno, ponerlo en otro lado, ¿dónde? O sea, Tizayuca.
Sí.
Se hicieron varios, Tizayuca hay unos temas que van más allá del técnico. Sería un aeropuerto extremadamente lejos y también tiene implicaciones de costo de movilidad. ¿Cómo llegas allá? ¿Qué implicaciones tendrá en la mancha urbana, etcétera? Pero realmente nosotros, pues sí, lo que decidimos, más que ahondar en el debate de si debería ser en otro lado o no, es tratar de que este proyecto en curso funcione y no sea como tantos otros que han sucedido en nuestro país que son un absoluto fracaso para el erario público y para los usuarios y para los habitantes de la zona que sufren consecuencias ambientales.
More questions?
Sí, volviendo al tema, o sea, que no se tomen malas decisiones, pues esa decisión se toma tan frívolamente que parece que no fue analizada de una manera adecuada, ¿sí? Y el segundo, yo siento que hay aeropuertos en Puebla, en Querétaro, en Toluca, en Cuernavaca, que están subutilizados, están en un radio de 100 kilómetros de la Ciudad de México, y que sería muy conveniente integrarlos para formar un sistema aeroportuario de todo el altiplano. Invertir mejor en estos trenecitos que quieren hacer, pero que lo planeen gentes que sepan de trenes, para que no nos pongan una pendiente del 5% en el tren de Toluca, México, que no sé quién pueda dormir tranquilo con esa pendiente. pendiente de los que están participando en este proyecto, ¿verdad? Pero bueno, ahí se los cuento. A ver, ¿qué me pueden decir al respecto?
Okay, one more question.
For Cajal, sorry to go back to slot issues, but you talked about longer runway being of value only to certain users. Is this a rationale for weight-based landing fees, and how does that play in price signals for capacity expansion?
As it happens, I recall having a conversation with you, Mike, on one occasion in Hamburg, and you were saying that when aircraft switched to jet aircraft, and the runways all needed to be adapted to reflect that the runway pricing principles applied now, weight-based pricing, were designed to cause the jets that were heavier to bear more of the cost, because in fact the runway adaptations were being made for the jet airlines. So I think there's certainly a question now for the development of very long-haul point-to-point services, and also, of course, maybe much heavier aircraft in some ways as well, as to whether there is a modification of the runway pricing principle. I can't offer one myself, but that would be administratively straightforward and would go some way towards distributing the cost to reflect the fact that they are being provided for very particular users. So that would seem to be a tremendously useful matter to research and explore.
Okay, perfect.
This is, I guess, more of a comment for Anna. I would encourage your group and others to really get educated and involved in the slot issue, because I think it's an issue that people don't know about, and so they're not naturally going to sort of, it's not something the public is going to naturally get involved in. So I think that's very, very critical. I just remember from the New York experience, you'd have a discussion with 10 airlines in the room, 1 academic and 3 FAA people. Some airline person would say, well, here's such and such a proposal. Seems like everybody in the room likes it, but there was nobody there representing passengers. And I just think that's very critical, and it's just not an issue that, the public knows about and understands, whereas it's an issue that, if done properly, you can really benefit the public. So I guess it's not a question, except how, what are the ways you can influence the process, and so.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. I totally agree. That's why in the study that we published last April, we mentioned that this is something that we should take into account and analyze further. That's the reason that I'm here. I actually learned a lot these past 2 days, and I hope to be in communication with many of you. And we actually want the COFESE, the Commission Federal Commission on Competition, to get more involved in this as well. So that's one of the strategies that we are proposing for the new airport.
If I could just offer an observation about cost overruns, which we've heard about, and which are big transport projects are tremendously expensive, and a 10 or 20% cost overrun is a very great deal of money. Now, the approach we took in Dublin, which may or may not be transferable to other places, and of course which the airline at the airport hated, was to say, you're building a new terminal. Here is the agreed budget for that facility. If you open a facility with those characteristics, the airport charge will be increased sufficient to allow you to recover the budget. If you spend a lot more, that's your problem. Now, we were never completely sure whether the courts would consider that to be a reasonable approach. And happily, we were never in court to find out. But I think that ought to be the starting point for tramways and underground, and for any other such projects, the starting point should be, you know, the passenger is, on behalf of the passenger, we are agreeing to make a certain payment. If you build a facility at that standard, for less, you can take those extra profits, because if you overspend, you're left with the consequences. And I think the implication is transport companies will go bankrupt more often than today. But since the infrastructure will still be there after they're gone, it is possible to have legislative provisions to allow a different body to take over the assets and to make sure they continue to function. And such a regime undoubtedly has a very strong effect on the transport company. A world where they believe cost overruns will simply be paid for and who cares, versus a world where they think they have to find money to go to their shareholders or whoever and say, well, we've lost a fortune. The extent of cost overruns, I think, is certain to be different in the two cases.
Thank you. More questions? No? Well, let's thank our panel.
Muy bien, vamos a tomar un receso hasta las 12:30, como ya saben.